Welcome back to Kids Life. We've been having so much fun this month talking about the unbelievable miracles Jesus did. We've learned about Jesus healing a leper, calming a storm, feeding 5,000 people with fish and bread, and today we're going to learn about another unbelievable miracle. No, it's not the miracle of a fidget spinner. It's the miracle in our Bible story where someone walks on water. Do you think if I tried to walk on water, I could sink or float? Well, newsflash, I would sink because people, human beings, cannot walk on water. Let's do an experiment to see whether different objects, I've got a few objects here, can float or sink. And I want to show you an object one at a time, and then I want to ask you to raise your hand if you think it will sink or float. Let's start with my sunglasses. These are amazing VBS Focus BBS sunglasses, which is coming up. Please tell your parents to sign you up, and if you have a credit card, you can sign yourself up. That'd be great. I think the website's like onelifechurch.tv/VBS, so just tell your parents, okay? So these are amazing. We got these for the VBS. What do you think? Will they sink or float? Raise your hand if you think they will sink. Sinkers? Hands up if you think they'll sink. Okay, let's give it a try. Ready? They sink! All right, so those of you who raised your hands, you were right. Give yourself a point. We're not going to keep score, but just give yourself an imaginary point, okay? Let's throw this away. I don't want this anymore. All right, what about this pencil? Raise your hand if you think it will sink. Hands up, hands up, hands up. Okay, here we go. And yes! Well, actually, no. No, it won't sink. It will float. So if you had your hands up for it to sink, you're wrong. It actually floats, I guess because it's made of wood or something. I learned that in school. Okay, next one. What about this little Lego character? It looks like a pirate guy. Hands up if you think he'll sink. If you think he'll sink, hands up. Here we go. He floats! Oh my goodness. Good thing. This is like us. We can actually sort of maybe float a little bit if we're on our back. Okay? So, take away a point if you raise your hand on that. Okay? He's gone. Okay? Hot Wheels. My little anchor. My son, he loves Hot Wheels and cars. Do you think it will sink? Okay. Sink. Hands up. Here we go. Boom. Oh, totally sinks. A point if you got it right. A couple more here. What do you think about the fidget spinner? Very fancy fidget spinner. I know no tricks, but that's okay. If you think it'll sink, raise your hand. Ready? Oh, and it does sink. Oh my goodness. So if you were looking to have a fidget spinner to save your life in a storm, this is not the object you should have with you. And finally, a rubber bouncy ball. Sink, raise your hand. Of course it doesn't sink, it floats. Okay, so we just looked at a few things that might sink or might float. Just to remind you, we said this earlier, humans sink. But we can also make ourselves float, like I said, if we maybe lie on our back or, if we've got like a snorkel or something. But if you tried to stand up and walk directly onto the water, you would definitely sink. I've tried to do that, to run super fast across the pool. Eventually, step 2, you go right to the bottom. Okay, today we're going to talk about 2 people who walk on water. Can you believe that? Sounds insane. Almost unbelievable. And this leads us into this week's big idea. Jesus can do the impossible. The story actually takes place right after the story from last week where Jesus has fed 5,000 people with just a few loaves of bread and some fish. Jesus sent the disciples away in a boat while he dismissed the huge crowd, and he spent some time praying by himself. After he was done praying, Jesus wanted to go join his disciples, but they were out in a boat in the middle of a lake. This, of course, is not a problem for Jesus. Jesus literally walks out to his disciples who were in the middle of the lake. Did you hear that? He walked out to them. Jesus was doing the impossible and walking on water. When the disciples saw him, they actually thought he was a ghost, like a crazy ghost, super scary. And they were terrified. The first thing Jesus said to his disciples was to have courage. That's because Jesus could tell how scared they were. He didn't want them to be afraid, but instead to know that he was with them and that he could do the impossible. One of Jesus' disciples, his name was Peter, still wasn't totally convinced. He called out to Jesus. He was like, "If it's really you, then tell me to come out onto the water." So Jesus told him to come out on the water. And what happened next was incredible. Fixing his eyes on Jesus, Peter stepped out of the boat and began to walk on the water towards Jesus. Peter trusted Jesus enough to step out of the boat and have courage to do something that seemed impossible. He had faith. Faith is having complete trust in Jesus. But then Peter took his eyes off of Jesus. He looked around and noticed the big waves and the wind. And once he stopped looking at Jesus, he became afraid and began to sink. He cried out, "Lord, save me!" Immediately, Jesus reached out and he caught him. Jesus was right there with Peter the whole time. This story reminds us when we are scared or facing problems or feel like we're stuck or we're starting to sink, we need to remember to focus on Jesus and let him give us courage. When we're scared, we can trust God because Jesus can do the impossible. When I was in 9th grade, my parents told me that we were going to be moving back from Israel, where we were, to America. And I was afraid to leave everything I knew. I thought I would lose all of my friends. I thought I would lose any connection to culture and I knew English, but also I would lose all my friends who spoke Arabic, and I wouldn't know any of the jokes or be cool or know any of the sports and be able to do anything that really gave me relationships. And so it felt like I was afraid that it might be impossible to make new friends, that I wouldn't have anything in common with the people here in America. What made it easier was in those moments I remember that God would always be with me. In the middle of my storm of living somewhere for 15 years and then having to live somewhere totally new, I knew that God was waiting for me and he was calling me. So back to the story from the Bible. You see, Peter could only continue walking on the water when he kept his focus on Jesus. When Peter let his attention move away from Jesus, he started to sink. But as long as he kept his eyes on Jesus, Jesus was able to do the impossible through him. Just like the disciples in the story, we can trust Jesus too. And sometimes if we keep our eyes on Jesus, like Peter tried to do, we can even be a part of one of God's miracles because Jesus can do the impossible. We've learned so much this month. We've been talking about the unbelievable and amazing miracles of Jesus. Let's see if you can remember what we talked about. When we heard the story of Jesus healing the leper, we learned that Jesus cares about us when we're sick and that we can show kindness to those who are sick. When we heard the story of Jesus calming the storm, we learned that Jesus cares about us when we're afraid and that he will never leave us. When we heard the story of Jesus feeding 5,000 people with only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, we learned that Jesus can provide for our needs and that we can trust him to keep his promises. And today, we heard the story of Jesus and Peter walking on water. We learned that Jesus can do the impossible and that we can get out of our comfort zones to let Jesus show us his power. Thanks so much for listening today, and I'll see you guys later.